Sure.
Big
Oh, you're the
dog.
communist.
So,
Yeah, they started
You
late.
didn't know?
Oh.
speaking of assignments for this week, who's that? Who are you pointing to, Jan?
This is the aliens. Alejandro's still sleeping.
Tell me who's that.
I don't know if you can see him, but
No, I can't see him at all.
I can only see a black screen. That's it.
Yeah, that's all I can see, Jan, is a black screen.
let me turn the brightness up. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
There he is. Alejandro, let's go. Get on this call. Let's go.
Well,
That's so.
he has to go walk his dog.
Oh,
Watch the lesson.
And then he has to
Dog's
take
more
a
important.
nap.
Dog's more
of course
important.
he does.
Dogs are horrible creatures. Who said that?
Excuse me.
Whoa.
I feel
Wait.
offended.
Said they're horrible.
Who's horrible? Dogs or rats?
Yes, both, but dogs
Yeah,
more.
chill.
Oh, okay. One of them is superior.
No, dogs are lovely.
Exactly.
I have a dog.
Yeah, it depends on the
Depends on
dog.
the dog.
bruh.
Wait, do you have a dog, Mr. Alias?
I
Let
do.
me show you my dog.
Did you ask him if he has
You
a
should
dad?
put him on
I
camera.
have like
Put him on
multiple
camera.
pictures of
I
my
don't
dog.
You do? Getting
Oh, I
sick.
thought you said you did.
Oh.
Mr.
Did you
Ayler,
ask him
do
if
you
he
have a
has
dad?
No, I don't.
I don't think I'm gonna show my face. I don't want to show my face.
All right. So,
Hey,
This is my
listen.
dog.
oh, we're showing off our pets now.
It's the
All right.
aliens, my dog.
We're going to go ahead and get started. So, a couple things about everybody's assignments for this week. I posted them all on Monday, so you should have seen them already. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me about them. As I mentioned the other day, they are all review for Unit 2, the first one. So there is a reading there that will cover all of Unit 2. That is something that if you have the capability to print out, I recommend you doing that after you finish it, because it's something that you'll want to refer to when you sit down to take your AP exam next month, okay? So if it's possible, if you can print it out, I would do that. If not, take a picture of it after you finish it so you have it on your phone. That way it's a reference sheet that you can refer to when you sit down to take your AP exam. So that's just something, that I kind of recommend that you do, okay? All right, any questions about assignments for this week before we get to the Mongols?
I'll actually do them.
Corona.
Yeah, I know, Jan. I know I'm in the middle of like a giant battle here. I'm broadcasting to you today.
Oh my god.
That's my
That's
dog,
called
man.
Corona.
He lives life on the edge.
That's called
I
Corona.
Yesterday I was hiding in the grass. Or no, Monday I was hiding in the grass.
What?
What?
I
In the
didn't
castle,
Like grass. Hold on, I'll show you. On Monday, I used this as the background.
I
Oh,
thought
you remember.
immersed memory. I don't remember seeing that.
Yeah.
What kind of grass looks like that? That's too perfect.
The other class.
my grass, I'm Mexican.
Oh my.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Today we're talking about the Mongols, which I know for some of you is like your favorite topic. So let me go ahead.
I love the Mongols.
I know. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. There we go. All right, so we are on to the Mongol moment today, that big moment for the Mongols. Now, things that we want to be thinking about or things that we want to be able to do by the end of this lesson, okay, is to explain how state building declined in Eurasia over time, explain how the expansion of these empires, particularly the Mongols, influenced trade and also communication, and then finally explain what the significance of the Mongol Empire was. So those are the things that we're looking to do over the next today's class, okay? All right, so the first thing that I want to draw to your attention is if we take a look at this map here, okay? What this map shows is a whole bunch of different portions, if you will, of what would later become the Mongol Empire, Okay, these are all independent states at the time. Okay, and they are eventually going to be united under the Mongol Empire. So the first thing we need to realize about the Mongols is that they didn't start out completely united. Okay, that the unification happened over time, and they initially started out as a whole bunch of different states, what they would call khanates at the time. Okay, a khanate is just like a state. Okay, they all operated completely independently of each other, and so they did not begin or did not start out as being unified. Okay, and so you can kind of see all the different independent states here. Okay, now we also know that as these empires expanded, okay, they began to facilitate long distance trade. And so as the Mongol Empire, once it united and began to expand and move further and further west, that began to really facilitate some of that different trade across Europe, across Asia, and then into North Africa. Okay, so when the empire expands, both trade also expanded, and then also communication expanded. Those three things are kind of all interconnected. Okay, so that when you talk about the political expansion, you need to also talk about what the economic factors there were, and how as these empires expanded, they also expanded economies. Okay, additionally, okay, as the Mongol Empire expands, you're also seeing, right, the expansion of contact between these different cultures, and that contact results in the transfer of not only knowledge, which is a good thing, okay, but also things like diseases, which obviously is a bad thing. Okay, and so when these contacts happen, okay, you know, obviously you are going to see things like medical knowledge that the Muslims had, or scientific knowledge that the Muslims had. That's going to make its way into Western Europe for the first time. The number system is going to make its way into Western Europe for the first time. A lot of these advances which come to Western Europe only come as a result of the expansion of these empires and the expansion of these trading networks. Okay, so they're all consequences of trade, which is one of those reasons why, like, if you're sitting down to write an essay, okay, you can try to relate everything back at some point to trade. Okay, because that's how a lot of culture spreads. Okay. Oh, move on. There we go. Okay. We also owe part of this to the pastoral people. Okay, recall that pastoral people, many of them were extremely nomadic. These are like your kind of hunter-gatherers. Okay, these are people who would take their animals out and they would let them graze. Okay, and they would kind of have to move around depending on the land that was available for grazing. And these pastoral peoples, not only did they ultimately build very large and very powerful empires, okay, but they also, as they expanded, they also integrated the people from the areas that they conquered. And so what you're seeing then is you're seeing the pastoral world, okay, joining together with the agricultural world. So you're seeing farmers and these pastoral peoples kind of being joined together or being united into a single empire. Okay, but please, please, please do remember that the Mongols started out as a pastoral nomadic people. Okay, I think a lot of people assume when they think of the Mongols, right, they think of this very large and very powerful and very ruthless empire, and they assume that they just started out that way, and that's not the case. The Mongols began, as I said, the Mongols began as these nomadic farmers, okay, or not even farmers, excuse me, as these nomadic pastoralists. So it really is a very gradual shift from these nomadic pastoralists to becoming this very large and very powerful empire that they would ultimately become. Okay, so pastoral people, okay? We know a few things about pastoralists, okay? Number one, we know that their economies are not that large, okay, because it's extremely limited what they can do. So they're not going to be particularly wealthy. However, they're going to need large amounts of territory because these animals have to have a large amount of land to graze. Okay, so what that's going to lead to then is a very small population. These are not going to be particularly large populations at all. They're going to be a smaller group of people, but they're still going to require large amounts of land. So the population is small, but the amount of land that they require is going to be very, very large. Okay, obviously they're also going to be highly mobile. They have to follow the grass. Okay, they have to follow the animals. So when the animals have grazed over a particular area, they have to move on to another part of their territory, or they have to expand their territory as a result of that, okay? And it becomes very, very seasonal, right? So they're typically moving about 4 to 6 times a year, again, depending on where there's grazable land, okay? They were very much dependent upon their agricultural neighbors. This is one of the reasons why they ultimately have to come together, okay? These pastoralists can't live on their own, okay? They require the goods to be produced, the farming goods to be produced by the agriculturalists, just like the agriculturalists, the farmers, required what the pastoralists had to offer them. So they were very much interconnected, okay? They were extremely close, okay? They were very close-knit. Families stayed very close together. And they tended to not spread out very, very much, okay? So whatever group you were born into, that was sort of the group that you spent your entire life with, okay? So there was not a lot of branching out. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, because it did, but it typically happened on a very small scale. And it was such a small scale, in fact, that most of the different clans or most of the different groups could all share a common ancestry, okay? Now, the pastoralists, just like the Mongols, the pastoralists, okay, offered women a fairly higher or much better status than they would have had they joined traditional Chinese societies, okay? So for that, we do have the Mongols to thank, and I think I've mentioned that to you before, because remember that these pastoral peoples are the precursor to the Mongols. And so women in these pastoral groups, again, did have a much greater role. Women could become tribal leaders, okay? Women held the same jobs and had many of the same responsibilities that men did, okay? Now, whether or not that was because they generally thought that men and women were equal, or because they needed women to do the work because there were so few of them, that we don't really know. But what we do understand is that both men and women, okay, held many of the same roles in these pastoral societies. Okay. Whoops, there we go. Okay, so becoming a nomad like this, okay, obviously it provided a very different, sort of life than becoming a farmer. This was like an alternative. So this was like, if you wanted to do something different, you would go become a nomad. Okay, it was an alternative to sort of just being a plain old farmer. Okay, now few people had the ability to live away from the products of the animals. Okay, and so they often had to trade because they couldn't produce a lot of the goods that they needed on their own because they were nomadic and they were just moving all the time. They had to trade. So they had to approach agricultural societies, okay, and they had to trade with them. So part of this trade came out of necessity. Now, they didn't have a lot of money, obviously. The profit margins here were extremely thin, and so they didn't have an army, okay? So these nomadic societies did not have any kind of army, and they didn't have any kind of an extensive government, okay? What they did have, though, is they were extremely tribal, and they were extremely loyal to their local leaders, okay? So there was no kind of central government that ruled over all of them, okay? They were simply loyal to their local and their tribal leaders, which meant that there was no kind of central ruler, no kind of bureaucracy, so there was nothing overall controlling them, okay? However, they did have several advantages, okay, that agricultural societies didn't. Number one, they had plenty of horses, okay, plenty of animals to ride on the backs of. They also were much better hunters, so they were much more suited for living out in the middle of nowhere, okay, because they were able to live and to survive in these environments that otherwise would have been considered unsuitable, okay? You know, they were out living up in the mountains, okay? They were out living in these plains, okay? So they were living in places which otherwise would have been considered extremely unsuitable, and certainly something that the farmers, okay, would not have been able to do, okay? And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, in some places, you're going to see new forms of government, okay? These are going to be called khanates, okay, Mongol khanates. So this is the beginning of the unification of the Mongols, okay? This is the beginning of these city-states being formed. Now, these are not at all centralized, okay? As I mentioned before, they are extremely independent. Each of these city-states does not pledge any kind of loyalty to any central authority or any central leader. They're all operating extremely independently of each other, okay? Similar to what you're seeing over in Western Europe at this time with feudalism, okay? These khanates are extremely similar to that. Recall from last Friday when I talked about feudalism, we explained or we talked about how feudalism led to a very decentralized government. There was no central leader. There was no central ruler. It's the same thing with these khanates. These city-states are all operating completely independently of each other, okay? Now, that doesn't mean, okay, that there wasn't conflict, because there was, okay? They did come into contact with each other often. Some of those contacts were very, very good and provided them opportunities for trade, okay, and for the sharing of goods and other products, including culture, okay. Some of them were not so good, okay, and when you get to talking specifically about the Mongol Empire, you'll see that this, you know, often was an exchange that was not good, okay, and that's simply because the Mongols, and here you can kind of take a look at the map of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol Empire was all about expanding territory and was all about making the empire larger and more centralized, okay? And so when we start to talk about what we consider the sort of classic Mongol Empire under the leadership of Genghis Khan, okay, when we start to think about that, the Mongol Empire really starts to become a lot more centralized under Khan, okay? And you can see, if you look at the red arrow here on the map, you can see how the Mongol Empire expands under Genghis Khan, and then the green arrows represent the routes or the directions of his successors. So as you can see, most of the expansion occurs under Genghis Khan. His successors are moderately successful at sort of expanding the territory of the Mongol Empire. But Khan did the most work, and Khan had the job first of uniting all of these independent states. So remember that before Genghis Khan, all of these city-states, okay, that you see here on the map in orange and green and red and purple, they were all completely independent. And it was up to Genghis Khan to sort of unite them, okay? But you can see, like, you know, at some point, the Mongols make it almost to Italy, okay? Italy is right over here, okay? This was the boundary of the Mongol Empire. So you can see that they were definitely pushing into Western Europe. Now they are stopped, okay? But they did make a push into Western Europe. And then of course, remember the other thing about the Mongols is that, you know, they were extremely, extremely powerful, but it was for a very short period of time, okay? Historians often refer to it as the Mongol moment because it comes and goes very, very quickly, okay? But we'll get more into that later. The Mongol Empire as a whole, because they were only around for such a short period of time, in terms of their cultural impact, it's not that great because they simply didn't last that long. Okay. The other thing that kind of limited their sort of cultural impact is that the Mongols never tried to spread religion or their belief system among the people that they conquered. They didn't care about a religion. Okay. They simply wanted to exploit those people. They simply wanted to defeat them militarily and then take over the territory. They were not interested in converting these people into good Mongols. In fact, the Mongols couldn't have cared less about any of that. They wanted territory and they wanted resources. Okay, so it's important for you to note that they did not, unlike some of these other empires, okay, they did not spread their culture as much because they simply didn't care. And so if we're looking for places in the world now where we could find traditional Mongol culture, Mongolia really is going to be the only place where you're going to see that extensively. Okay. Now, if we were to contrast this with another empire from that time period, we might consider the Turks. Okay. The Turks, the Turkish Empire, they also expanded territory, but unlike the Mongols, they brought their language and they brought their culture with them, and they forced the people that they conquered to sort of take on both that language and that culture. The Mongols didn't do any of that because they didn't care. The Mongols, again, wanted territory and they wanted resources. That was really all that they were interested in, okay? And so with the Mongols, as you can see in this painting here, it was conquering by the sword, okay? They were looking to conquer their enemies militarily. There were no peaceful exchanges here, okay? The Mongols had a reputation, deservedly so, for being quite ruthless. Okay, they were warriors. Okay, this was absolutely a society that was built on the strength of its military. So do not misunderstand that. They also did have the benefit, right, of having a very, very strong, very powerful ruler. Okay, first it was Genghis Khan. Okay, now there's lots of different ways that you can spell this. Okay, some people, you'll see it spelled, what it looks like there, Chinggis Khan. Okay, just like with the word Quran and some other words, depending on how it's translated, is going to depend on how you see it spelt. When Genghis Khan is translated into English, it means universal ruler. That's the sort of important takeaway here, because he was a ruler over the entire territory, okay? And so he united all of these different tribes, all of those different cities, or all of those different khanates, all of those different states that I showed you on the map previously. He had united them, okay? And he did it because, okay, two reasons that he does it. Number one, he wants control over all of those resources, okay? Number two, he knows that if he's going to continue to expand the Mongol Empire to the west, he knows that he needs followers, okay? That he needs people who are going to willingly join his military and do what he tells them to do. So he does offer certain rewards to people who would follow him, okay? And he begins his first war for territory in 1209, okay? So he had been the Mongol leader for a few years before that. I forget exactly when he takes over, but it is in 1209 when he launches his first military campaign. And that is a significant date because for about the next 50 to 60 years or so, the Mongols are constantly at war with somebody. So he sort of christens or sort of sets off about a half a century or so of just continuous war, okay? Now, when he dies, okay, because he dies before that 50 to 60 year period of war ends, he does, pass this sort of conquering mindset on to his successors. Okay, so he's not, it's not like this dream of a Mongol empire dies with him. It does continue on afterwards. Kublai Khan is probably the most well-known of those people, but certainly not the only one, okay? But all of these Khans that come after him, and if you take a look at the map here, okay, you can see sort of the lineage or sort of the heritage here of all of these Khans which come after him. And so the ones that are in dark blue are the ones who became ultimate rulers of the Mongols. So if you want to follow that family tree, you can see, you know, sort of how it spreads. Okay. Now, here's what's really interesting, and I bring this up because this gets asked a lot. Okay. There is this rumor going around about Kublai Khan having like literally hundreds of children. Okay. And there is some science that proves that this is probably to a certain extent true. Now, did he have 750 children? Okay, as is often reported, probably not. Okay, but did he have a lot of children? Probably yes. Okay, because if you look at some of the data here, okay, and if you look at all of this territory, this was all territory that at one point was part of the Mongol Empire. Okay, even today, about 10% of the men who live in that area that was once a part of the Mongol Empire, about 10% of them can claim that they share at least some DNA with Genghis Khan. That means about 10% of the men that live in that area could be considered descendants of Khan. And that is a very significant number, because if you realize that we are talking about millions of people that live in that area, that means that we are talking about hundreds of thousands of people who can claim lineage to Genghis Khan. 10% of the male population in that area can tie their DNA in some way to Genghis Khan. Okay, what does that look like in terms of the sheer number? What does that look like in terms of the sheer numbers today? That's about 0.5% of the male population, which roughly translates to about 16 million people who could claim direct lineage to Khan. So yes, he almost undoubtedly had many, many children, okay? Whether or not 750 is an accurate number, probably not. And I do see that the chat's blowing up right now. So let me take a minute. Let's pop into the chat and see what we've got. He would have been broke from all the child support. Yes, probably. He's a legend. I would agree. Kayla is a descendant of Khans. Maybe so. Yeah, I agree, Mika. Let's see. Yeah, see, a lot of you are fascinated about the fact that he had all these children. Okay, he's the real reason why we have overpopulation. I mean, maybe so, right? Again, I've said it many times. Thanos probably didn't have the wrong idea. Okay, you know, maybe good old Thanos was right about certain things. Okay, so let me hop back up here. Okay, there we go. All right, so again, just popping back onto this map here, okay? The area that I've circled on this map in the gray circle, that's sort of where things start, okay? And then as you can see, it begins to fan out from there, okay? So that's sort of where the Mongol Empire begins. Notice that they don't make it too far east. Korea is about as far east as they get. So they don't get up into Japan, and they don't make it down into the Philippines or into India, or down into what's modern day Vietnam. Okay, Khan wasn't interested as much in this territory as he was in moving west. Okay, so a lot of this expansion of his pushed him to the west, not to the east. Okay. Now, if we're talking specifically about what the legacy of Khan was within China, understand that China was the hardest territory that Khan had to conquer. Okay, China was the most difficult territory for him to conquer out of all of them. It took the Mongols about 70 years to fully conquer China, so this is not a quick movement at all. Okay, he starts by uniting the North and the South. At the time, South China was under the control of the Song dynasty, okay? And getting China united like this, okay, was an idea that a lot of the educated Chinese thought was a good idea. So a lot of the upper classes, a lot of the higher classes, they actually supported Khan coming in and supported the Mongols conquering them because they thought that he had that mandate of heaven. Now, when the Mongols did go into China, okay, they did adopt many of the Chinese administrative practices, meaning that they set up a taxation system like the Chinese had. They set up a postal service. They did all of those things. They sort of kept many of the features of the Chinese government in place. They called themselves Yuan, okay, so that was the name of their dynasty. So if you're looking at a list of the Chinese dynasties, remember that the Yuan dynasty is the Mongols, okay? And then Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, the one that I mentioned a little while ago, he's the one who's going to be the main emperor when the Mongols take over China. And he does build a lot of roads, he builds a lot of canals. He has a fairly low, kind of a fair taxation system, okay? And he is very, very much about scholars and about the arts and about artists. However, please understand that that does not mean that like things were great, okay? He was still a very harsh ruler, okay? And he still resented a lot of foreign influence, okay? In fact, most of the Mongols who ruled in China refused to learn Chinese as a language, okay? They continued to speak Mongol. They did not learn Chinese. Okay, and most of the laws that the Mongols set up were set up to very purposely discriminate against the native Chinese. They could not hold positions within the government, okay, and they were, definitely set up to be of a lower social class. They also forbid any kind of marriage between the Mongols and between Chinese, okay? So they did not at any point treat the Chinese as though they were at all equal, okay? Nevertheless, there are a lot of cultural achievements or cultural developments of the Yuan dynasty, okay? Yes, they were the group of people that made a lot of those porcelain pots that become very, very expensive and become a luxury good like the ones that we see traded along the Silk Roads, okay? Kublai Khan was very much a patron of the arts, and so he gave money to artists, okay? That was something that he believed in very, very thoroughly. Now, if we look to the western part of the Chinese Empire a little bit, okay, or not the Chinese Empire, excuse me, Mongol Empire. If we move to the west a little bit, okay, so now we're talking about what the Mongol conquest of Russia was like, okay? This happens during a 3-year period between 1237 and 1240, and the Russians had it worse than the Chinese or the Persians did, okay? Because at this point, when the Mongols moved into Russia, they already had the benefit of having conquered China, and they took a lot of Chinese weaponry, okay, that they used in these conquests that the Russians had not seen before. Things like the battering ram, things like the catapults. That gave the Mongols a very distinct advantage. Any of the Russians who survived any of these conquests, they were either deported or they were sold into slavery, okay? But here's the thing. Here's what makes Russia a little bit different. They didn't occupy Russia. They didn't want to stay there. They sort of conquered and they kept moving west further into Europe. And the reason for that is simply because the Russians didn't have a whole lot to offer them, okay? There weren't a lot of resources there. There weren't a lot of great, cities there that they could exploit. This part of Russia in particular is very, very barren. It's very, very cold. It snows for 10 months out of the year. So there just wasn't much there for the Mongols, okay? And so they did they didn't even really set up permanent settlements, okay? They simply just brought in nomadic people and, kind of let them just sort of graze in those areas as they saw fit. But they didn't set up colonies, they didn't set up settlements, okay? They were really sort of just using Russia as a stepping stone into Western Europe, okay? Now, what they did do is they did force the Russian leaders to send tribute, meaning money, to Mongolia, to their capital, and they did collect heavy, heavy taxes. Incidentally, okay, the Eastern Orthodox Church, or at the time it was called the Russian Orthodox Church, okay, they did quite well under Mongol rule, because remember, the Mongols didn't care what religion you practiced. And so the Russian Orthodox Church, kind of thrived, okay? They didn't pay any taxes. The Mongols didn't care about them. The Mongols kind of left them alone. Remember that one of the things about the Mongols that was kind of good, as it were, is that they did allow a lot of religious toleration, okay? And so because this rule was so indirect, okay, meaning that because the Mongols didn't set up shop within Russia like they did in China or like they did in Persia, because this rule was very, it was indirect rule. There was a lot more Russian culture that kind of survived the Mongol Empire than Chinese culture or Persian culture surviving in that part of the world, okay? And so speaking of Persia, okay, this is the last area that we see the Mongols moving into, okay? This takeover of Persia, this was an extremely abrupt takeover, okay? It happened very, very quickly, okay? Khan himself, okay, leads this particular invasion. It was, not only did it happen quickly, but it was still extremely destructive, okay? The Mongols, okay, were considered infidels in the eyes of the Persians, okay? These were not people of the book. So these, so we know that the Muslims tolerated the Christians, and we know that they tolerated the Jews. The Muslims did not like the Mongols, okay? And so the Muslims believed that because these were infidels, they believed that they were going to be able to beat them. And that was not at all the case. The Mongols were one of the only militaries at the time that was considered stronger than the Muslims. And so it is in 1258 that the Mongols conquer the capital city, which at the time was Baghdad. 200,000 people die in this particular attack. Okay, so it is a very bloody attack. A lot of these Persian farms get turned into pastures for the Mongols' animals, okay? They also direct the Muslims to produce more wine, because the Mongols loved alcohol, okay? And they also directed them to produce more silk, okay? Now, similar to what happens in China, the Persians, under control of the Mongols, the Persians become more, how do I put this? The Persians become more susceptible to Mongol culture than the Russians did, similar to what happened over in China. So that when the Mongols come into Persia, the Mongols adopt elements of Persian culture, okay? They use the already existing Persian government, okay? So they use that kind of setup. They don't make a whole lot of changes to it. They rebuild the roads in those cities that have been damaged. They rebuild the cities, okay? And perhaps the biggest thing, and historians still struggle to try to explain this, the biggest thing perhaps is that the Mongols who conquer the Persians become Muslims. We don't know why, okay? This is something that you don't see the Mongols that go into China, right? You don't see them become Confucianists. You don't see the Mongols that go into Russia become Russian Orthodox. We don't really know why the Mongols who moved into Persia became Muslims, okay? They did. We're not sure why, okay? But many of the Mongols who moved into Persia as a result of this conquest, became Muslim. And so what happens is when the Mongol Empire falls, as it inevitably does, when that Mongol Empire falls, because many of them had converted and had become Muslims, they were not forced out, okay? So they were not kicked out of Persia. They were kind of taken in and were drawn into and were assimilated into Persian society, okay? And so what you have then in the area that was once Persia, what you have then is this interesting mix of Mongol culture with Muslim culture. And that's, when we think of modern day Persian culture, that's what we now tend to think of, is this sort of mixing of very, very Asian culture with very, very Muslim, very, very Islamic culture. Okay, that's what we tend to think of now when we think of Persian, okay? And so if we were to break everything down for you, okay, into kind of a nice, neat little chart, and you think about what some of the positive impacts were of the Mongols versus what some of the negatives were, okay? In terms of positives, right, we know that they set up transportation routes. We know that they unified China, okay? We know that they went into Korea, okay, and they brought Korea into world trade. We know that they failed in terms of trying to invade Japan, okay? We said that they wanted to move west. We know that they were tolerant of these outside religions. So those are all positive impacts, okay? But then there were negative impacts as well, okay? They almost certainly were responsible for the spread of the Black Death because of their trading, okay? They destroyed the Japanese military and destroyed a lot of famous artifacts that were in Korea, okay? They probably prevented the Chinese, okay, under the Ming and the Ming Empire. They probably prevented them from sort of expanding seawise at the time. Okay, those people that lived in the countryside, they did very, very poorly. Okay, the Mongols didn't really care so much about agriculture, and so it was very much about, you know, life within those cities. Okay. And then, of course, what I didn't put up on here, because I think it's self-explanatory, what I didn't put up on here is the fact that the Mongols obviously killed many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. That certainly would be a negative impact there, okay, that you would see. Okay, so if we jump back here, now that we're done, does anybody have any questions for me about anything that we've talked about? If you do, you can unmute your mic and you can ask away. Any questions?
Who is
My
that?
dog, my dog, come back, Jesse, come back. My dog.
Questions at all?
Mr. Ehlers, who is that man?
What?
What? You don't know Jesse?
You don't know
That's my dog.
Jesse? No.
Jesse is the dog. Come on now.
Literally
Oh, there's Blake.
my baby.
Agreeing. That's the Mongols.
Oh, the Mongols. Wow.
Oh, wow.
Questions for me. Let me look at the chat, see if there's any questions. Was it all one girl? No, definitely not. Gracious, no. And so what I should have mentioned to you about that is the whole implication there that he had all these children, okay, is that he was sleeping around with lots and lots of women, lots and lots of concubines.
He was a pimp.
The nice way of saying prostitutes, okay?
Casanova.
This was not a man who was monogamous, okay? This was definitely a man, you know, who probably every city that he went into was looking for a different woman, okay?
My dog.
Hey, you never know, you never
Pass
know.
the time, you know.
Yes,
Do
just
you think he went to heaven or hell?
clarify that, okay? Any other questions that you guys have
Do you
about the
think he went to
Mongols?
heaven or hell?
Let me see. Jorge wanted to be his child.
Hey, Mr. Taylor, did you think he went to heaven or hell?
Me?
Yeah.
I have no
Genghis
idea.
Khan.
He was not a good person. I would say he's probably down in hell.
He
seems
can't
very
say
charming.
that,
boxing with
Mr.
Hitler in the
Ehlers.
gulag.
But I think I won't answer that question. Okay. That looks like
Genghis Khan.
beginning to be Chinggis Khan.
Jarlanes, you need to pull up a photo of a pregnant seahorse. That's what Genghis Khan was.
A pregnant seahorse?
What?
That's too
Yeah.
far.
All right. Any other questions before we wrap this up?
Tea.
No. He did drink a lot of tea. That's true.
He seems
Really?
like a very charming person.
Created a lot of tea
He's
too.
Asian. Asians love tea.
You're being so racist right now,
Stereotype
Mr.
saying.
Ehlers.
It's the
The
truth.
Asians loved you.
I think if he was alive right now, he would listen to
I think
BTS.
that was a stereotype.
Not the British also love tea. I mean, this is not.
British are racist.
not
You can't say anything about British people.
How is it racist? in the first
Yo,
place?
bro.
No.
Yo, bro.
They love
You can take
Oh,
that. We'll stop you.
T-Unit.
All right. Any other questions?
Why?
No? All right. So we will go ahead and end this call. I will have office hours beginning at 1 o'clock in about an hour or so. So I'll be around to answer any questions or anything that you guys have. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Have a lovely day. And I will see you guys.
Who is?
Sheila playing
Mr. Ehlers?
Kayla's going to send us off with some Minecraft music.
Wait.
Hey, put on the cat disc.
I will post the link to this meeting on the Teams page when it's up and ready to go. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Friday afternoon. Have a lovely day, guys.
Wait. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment.
Like,
Oh,
Hit
yeah.
the bell icon down
Follow
below.
me.
follow me. All right, see you guys later.
YouTube algorithm.
Au
is coming.
revoir. Bye, Mr. Ehlers.
Bye.
We'll
Wait,